Welcome to The Body Keeps the Score Part 2. In this series of lessons, we're discussing the relationship between trauma and the whole person. Here's what you need to know that trauma, whether it's a single event in your life or complex trauma over time, has a way of showing up in the whole person. We're drawing from the research found in the book, The Body Keeps the Score. And what we learn from the research is that trauma impacts our brain, our neurological system. It lodges in the body. And over time, it shows up in our relationships, in our very identity. How do we find healing from the impact of trauma and traumatic events in our life? The very first step is knowledge and understanding. And so let us take a deeper dive in this thought and this relationship of trauma and the whole person. Previously, we've discussed how trauma impacts the brain. Now I want to take you a step further and talk to you about how trauma impacts the body. So to do this, I need to recap for just a moment. What we've learned thus far is that God has so designed you and I that when we perceive threat or danger, fear, that we go into a reactive state of fight, flight, or freeze. And that is the autonomic nervous system doing exactly what it was designed to do. In many instances, that has saved your life. But if you've been deeply wounded by trauma in your life, if you've experienced traumatic events in your life, what can happen is we get stuck in that place of fight, flight, or freeze. Neurologically, that becomes our default setting. What do you mean? Well, maybe in your own life, and maybe you've seen it in the lives of those around you, that the slightest trigger can send the person from 0 to 100. We say things like they're so reactive, they're so emotional, they're so sensitive that they always overreact, or they have anger issues. They can't control their emotions. What's happening typically is due to past traumatic events, they've gone into fight, flight, or freeze, and they're stuck in that setting. And so the slightest trigger sends them back to that reactive state, and they repeat the cycle all over again. They feel the intensity of prior traumas. They feel the hurt, the pain, and they explode. And so what happens neurologically? We can get stuck in that place to the point where they have done studies now, and the research bears out where they've done brain scans of individuals that suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder and symptoms thereof, that the brain scans reflect that these patients, these individuals, are heightened in their reactive state, and many of them live in a constant state of chaos internally, neurologically. They're not broken, they're not diseased, they're stuck. They're stuck in that place. Now, how does that show up in our bodies? In all kinds of ways. In stress, irritability, yes, the inability to sleep well at night. Many times it impacts us with health issues. It impacts our autoimmune system and autoimmune diseases. Many times now through the research are linked to high levels of stress. Our body is flooded with adrenaline, cortisol. It's also associated with heart disease, with cancer, with ulcers, migraines. The list seems to go on and on and on. And so trauma impacts the brain. It lodges in our neurological system, and now it shows up in our physical body. So, yes, the body does keep the score. Trauma impacts the whole person. Trauma deeply impacts the quality of your life. Yes, it's a neurological response. It gets stuck in our body. It comes out in all types of ways, and it shows up in our relationships. Imagine, if you would, someone who is stuck in that traumatic response, that reactive response, that becomes now their default setting, easily triggered. Well, in a relationship, if you're in fight, flight, or freeze, very reactive, the fight, very emotional, or the freeze, you shut down, you wall off, you're frozen, emotionally unavailable, or you flee, you avoid intimate relationships. And so it greatly impacts us. It rewires the brain to where it causes us to show up in very unhealthy ways unless resolved. Kolk would say it like this: our brains are wired for connection, but trauma rewires them for protection. That's why healthy relationships are difficult for wounded people. So true is that. And yes, there is help, there is hope, but you have to understand where this is coming from to begin the process and the journey of healing. Trauma definitely impacts the whole person, neurologically, physically, emotionally. Trauma shows up in our relationships, the way we interact with everybody around us. And trauma shows up in our very identity. It goes to the very core of who you are. Many times, traumatic events cause a person to feel not only a great sense of guilt, but a sense of shame as well. And there is a great difference between the two. Guilt is this idea that I have done something bad. Shame is the idea that I am something bad. And shame twists and perverts our identity. And many times, individuals that have gone through traumatic events, especially complex trauma over their lifetime, deal with this heavy burden of shame. And so, shame is much more than an emotion, it is a belief about who I am as an individual. It's a belief about who you are. It's typically a belief about the way you see others, the way you see yourself, the way you see the world around you. And ultimately, it shapes the way you see God. And so shame can be very enabling for an individual. It can be very crippling. It can be very stifling in life. Kolk would say it this way: the greatest sources of our suffering are the lies we tell about ourselves. The shameful feelings that an individual may have, that you may have dealt with in your life, are but lies. Because who are we? Our identity is not in the trauma that happened. Our identity is in the Christ who loves you. You've been called by his name. You are his deeply beloved child. That is your identity. So you are better than what's happened to you. You are a child of God. You must be stronger than the trauma. You must not have the identity of the trauma. The trauma is your history, but it does not define who you are as an individual. Finally, I want to talk to you about healing from trauma. Trauma is not a life sentence. God has promised to heal our wounds and restore us completely. So I do believe that there is healing in trauma. When we go to the literature and we look at the healing modalities for trauma, typically there are two approaches. One is what I would call a top down approach, and the other a bottom up approach. You say, well, what is that? The top down approach is what you'd find in typical counseling, and it works for many people. You're right up in the prefrontal cortex and you're going back and you're looking at the story and you're inviting Jesus in your story and you're rewriting the story and processing the events. And that's helpful for a lot of people. But if you're talking with someone who is stuck in the fight, flight, or freeze, to go back to the past, to go back to the trauma, and to try to process that might actually be triggering. And it might cause a response that's very negative and very emotional. So they might not be able to go back there with you. So, what else do we have then? We have bottom up approaches. Because remember, trauma lodges in our body. We get stuck neurologically in that fight, flight, or freeze. And so your reaction is very heightened, and your blood pressure is up, and your heart rate is up. And so, what do? When we look at that, there have been great results found in alternative therapies to talk therapy, such as exercise, deep breathing, things like EMDR approaches. Those are very, very helpful because it's taking the body, getting the body to a place of rest. And so you're going from the autonomic nervous system to the parasympathetic nervous system, which is that rest and digest place. And so, what we've known from the research now for quite some years is that even PTS survivors of the 9/11 attack, many of the first responders, they found as much of a benefit in things like yoga, in things like dance, and other types of physical activity that brought them down to a place of calm and rest. And once you get to that point, once you get down to that place of calm and rest, then you can revisit the traumatic event. Then you can process, then you can talk about it, then you can rewrite your story. But you may need the bottom up approach first. And so there's top down and there are bottom up approaches. Both have a lot of validity to them. And it takes discernment on where to work with a person first. I believe that the bottom up approach can work with many to get them to where you can go top down. And let me say this because I like to put a biblical lens on all of the things that we talk about. But I'm going to take you to a verse in the Old Testament out of the life of David. There was a time in David's life where he was called into the court of King Saul. And the story goes that Saul experienced an evil spirit that came upon him, and it made him literally insane. And what does David do in ministering to King Saul? He doesn't talk to him about his emotions or his feelings or what has happened to him. He plays music, he plays his harp. And it is this bottom up approach that soothes King Saul. I'll take you to the scripture. Look, if you would, in 1 Samuel 16 and verse 23. And so it was, whenever the Spirit from God was upon Saul, that David would take a harp and play it with his hand. Then Saul would become refreshed and well, and the distressing spirit would depart from him. Notice that verse. It's a powerful verse. He's soothed, he's comforted. Music brings him to a place of calm. And when David played his harp, it affected Saul positively in three ways. He was refreshed, that's physical. He was well, that is emotional. The spirit departed from him, the evil spirit departed from him, and that is the spiritual outcome. And so many times, through getting our body in a natural rhythm, a state of calm can allow us to feel a physical relief because the fight or flight goes down, an emotional relief, and a spiritual reset. And so, what I'm saying is that trauma can be healed and trauma can be helped. And you can work with so many people who have experienced complex trauma in their life or immense, intense single events of trauma through bottom up and top down approaches. And so, this has been but an overview in the book, The Body Keeps the Score, putting some spiritual context to it and allowing you to have yet another tool in your toolbox to help individuals who have been intensely traumatized and are in deep need of God's healing.